Good afternoon, 20th Century Art students. Welcome to week three, and our focus is on abstract expressionism, gesture, uh, process, action, um, aspects um, aspects of artistic practice that are very closely related to our week two's focus on art and politics, on making art that is relevant to modern life. As as you know, it's a that aspect is the desire to make art that is responsive to or participates in or represents modern life is a concern that began with Baudelaire. It began with Henri de Saint-Simon. It began in the first quarter of the 19th century with the desire to find new forms, new mythologies, new images, new subject matter, new ways of representing a world that was understood and understood rightly as changing radically, and that somehow the religious imagery, the mythological imagery that had obtained for the last few centuries, since the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, um, didn't seem to captivate the imagination. Didn't seem to land emotionally and intellectually for these new generations of thinkers uh, and intellectuals who were deeply shaped and profoundly um, impacted by the French Revolution, by the philosophical and religious implications of the Enlightenment, and um, and so the desire was to find new ways for art to be relevant to life, and not just simply as a plaything for the rich and the powerful, which I mentioned last week was something that was very much a part of um, and has been a very much a part of the history of Western art. Um, those with leisure, resources, means, and a desire are the ones um, that serve as patrons and clients for the visual arts. And even though patrons and collectors, clients, whether they are religious or secular, um, often see the arts as offering decoration for an affirmation for their high station in life. That's simply a historical fact. Um, the fact that we believe it should be otherwise is evidence of the success of the avant-garde. Is the evidence of 200 years of thinking about and believing that art could do something more, that it can address basic political and social realities. That we question and that we criticize art for not doing that is evidence of the fact that that the very idea of it, the aspiration of it, has seeped in and shaped um, even the general public. And so I think that's an important thing for us to keep in mind as we circle back and think about um, last week's topic, and not evaluating the visual arts on whether it feeds more people or it has facilitated in making working conditions better. Although the arts and visual imagery have, in fact, had a tremendous impact. The Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation, may not have been as successful as it had without the work of Lucas Cranach, without his printing press, without the role of mechanical reproduction to provide visual imagery that accompanied the theological, the doctrinal the ecclesial writings of Martin Luther. And so visual culture, visual imagery does play a very important role in politics, in social processes. But whether that operates as art or not is a question that I've been thinking about for many years, and that it's something that that should occupy your thoughts as well. So visual imagery is often used as a tool for advertising, used as a tool for propaganda, used as a tool for all kinds of aspects of social and political activism. But there's a desire for high art to do something else, to do something more. And as I mentioned last week, even though Leonardo's patrons wanted him to design weapons to kill people and break down walls and to exert power, and then perhaps to decorate living spaces, to make other kinds of visual decorations like portraits. Leonardo understood the work that he did as a painter as something much more important, much more profound. And you could say that the history of Western art is the history of artists and those committed to it intellectually and emotionally, to thinking seriously about why it's important. How is it important? Why should those of us who are not dukes and presidents and popes and bishops be concerned about it and interested in it? And how does it help us be better human beings, live richer human lives? Pardon me. And so this week, as we move into the middle of the 20th century and we shift from Paris to New York City, we start with Harold Rosenberg's theory of action painting. The very fact that what Rosenberg sees in these artists like Pollock and de Kooning and Franz Kline, working in New York in the 1950s, is a concern for something more than just making an object. That somehow the process, somehow the practice itself is what makes it art, what makes it important. And there are a couple ways for us to look at it. One of the things that it does, by opening up painting from being a noun to a verb, is that it makes action the focal point of art, process the focal point of art. And if that's the case, and if painting is an event, if a painting is the record of a skirmish, as Rosenberg says, that it's a record or a relic, or in some implications, an unintended consequence of acting, then it opens up the whole field. Anything can be painting. Anything can be art. Any kind of action, any kind of gesture can potentially be art. What that means is something that we'll spend this week looking at, and you can spend the rest of your life thinking about it, which I have been thinking about. So in what context does a person being shot in the shoulder become art? For example, Chris Burden's performance in the early 1970s, in which he had somebody shoot him in the arm in an art gallery. Or how is that not attempted murder? Where is that line? Is there a line? How do we understand those gestures and those events and those activities? But one of the things that's important about this is by activating art, by making it operate as a process, it is one of the ways in which art can be seen as something that doesn't just hang on a wall, sit on a pedestal, in a gallery or a museum, and then it goes out into the streets. This is something we saw with the Dada. It's something we saw with the Futurists. A certain kind of radical desire to get art out from the museums and the galleries. And in fact, the Italian Futurists were so radical that they believed that the museums in Italy should be bombed and destroyed. That weight of the past was such a burden on contemporary life and contemporary creative activity, but they needed simply just to get rid of it. But one of the ways that intellectuals deal with it is that you reinterpret the past. You look at these objects in the past and you focus on the process, you focus on the action, you focus on ways in which art is seen as a verb and not just as a noun. And if it's a verb, it's also important. If it's a verb, it can't be collected. It can't be sold like a piece of merchandise. If we're looking at art and we understand art as an artifact, it can be. I can buy it, which means you don't have it. I can pay a lot of money for it, which means I reveal that I have a lot of money and I have a lot of power and I can own it and take it. If art is essentially a process, an event, an action, nobody can buy and sell it. And so by pushing against the market, by pushing against art as something that is possessed, brings with it a deep political implication. And that is art that is operating outside of a particular system of currency, of power relations. So whether or not the art has a message, has a political message or a social message, the very fact that art can be interpreted, is understood, is experienced as something that ultimately cannot be bought and sold, brings with it a critique of social structures with political implications. Another thing that's important that's taking place in the middle of the 20th century, particularly in New York, is a concern with the Cold War. And as totalitarian regimes were making inroads, not only throughout Europe, obviously with fascism, with National Socialism, those totalitarian regimes in the Soviet Union, in Germany, in China, and throughout the world. What is at stake is human freedom, individual human freedom, the capacity for the individual to act freely, without constraints. And one of the places, and certainly since the Romantics in the late 18th century, understood what was understood as one of the great activities and important activities that affirm human creativity, human individuality, is art. And so what Harold Rosenberg is writing about in the early to mid 1950s about art as action, about the gesture, about the process, brings with it the belief in the dignity of human action, the dignity of a single human being who can take a brush, load it with paint, and act freely, creatively, by scraping that paintbrush along that scrap of canvas. Or, in the case of Jackson Pollock, unrolling that unstretched canvas on the floor of his Long Island studio in the Springs and pour and drip paint. What may visually look as chaos, what may look at like disorder, perhaps even interpreted as some kind of nihilistic refusal to represent nature and the world, is in fact an affirmation of the dignity of human creativity. And it was interpreted as such in the middle of the 20th century in New York. And there are deep connections between, very ironic, I think, with the emergence of this new, distinctively American avant-garde, this new way of painting, that becomes something that's quite useful for the American government um, to promote, and they did through and in collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art. Years 1958 to 1959, an international traveling exhibition curated by Alfred H. Barr, called The New American Painting, which featured these artists, the abstract expressionists, and this exhibition circulated from about, over this 2-year period, 12 to 13 European museums. And the emphasis was, and with the support of the American government, with the support of the CIA, offering funding not only to the museum but also to artists, it affirmed human creativity. It affirmed the dignity of human action. Pardon me. It affirmed also the fact that New York, that American culture could be a center of high culture. And so while the Cold War was raging, the Museum of Modern Art was circulating an exhibition that was participating in what could be called the Cultural Cold War. Freedom, American democracy, however you want to understand it, as the antidote to totalitarian regimes around the world, gives rise to abstract expressionism. And so the emphasis on action, the emphasis on process, becomes a way to affirm the dignity of human action. Whether it's random or not, the very fact of unconstrained human action can affirm the dignity of what it means to be a human, particularly in the context of these totalitarian regimes. So I hope these thoughts have been helpful to you. I look forward to interacting with you this week and reading your discussion prompts, and I hope the material has been challenging to you in providing broad enough structures with our week 1 with abstraction and expressionism, week 2 with art and politics, this week with gesture and process, and as we move through for the next couple weeks, to provide broad enough, a broad framework and structure for you to think about the 20th century art and culture in these broad, interwoven concepts. So I hope they help you, and please, I hope you have a good week and many blessings to you. Thank you.